History is usually painted in black and white, but occasionally a man comes along who is too big, too loud, and too messy to fit any mold. He was a man who looked like a brute, but spoke like a poet. A man who saved a nation with one hand while dipping the other into the treasury. If you stood in the bloody streets of Paris in 1793, you wouldn't look for a general. You'd listen for the thunderous voice of Georges Danton. He was the one who told the executioner to show his severed head to the crowd because it was worth seeing. We must look at this man rotten to the core because somehow he was the only one who could save France. So why did this hero end up being sent to the guillotine by his own best friend? The story begins far from the clamor of the guillotine in the quiet, chalky plains of Champagne in a small town called Arcis-sur-Aube. It was here, under the pale skies of rural France, that the man who would one day shake the foundations of Europe was born in October 1759. Georges-Jacques Danton was not molded for greatness by birth. He was the son of a respectable but ordinary lawyer, a boy from the middle class who seemed destined for a life of obscurity. His family was neither destitute nor noble. They were the fabric of the provincial bourgeoisie, people who believed in order, rules, and the slow, steady accumulation of comfort. But nature, it seemed, had a different plan for young Georges, marking him for violence and chaos from the very moment he took his first breath. If you were to look at the adult Danton, the titan who stood at the podium of the convention, the first thing you would notice was the violence written on his face. It was a map of childhood trauma, a topography of pain that he wore like a mask. The local legends of Arcis tell us that the universe seemed intent on destroying him before he could grow. As a toddler barely steady on his feet, he wandered into a barnyard and was attacked by a bull. It was a violent, primal encounter that should have killed a child of his size. The beast's horn ripped into his face, tearing his lip apart and crushing the structure of his nose. He survived, but the damage was permanent. His mouth was forever twisted, giving him a permanent, cynical sneer, and his nose was flattened against his skull. Before he could fully recover from the bull, fate struck again in the form of a stampede of pigs. He was trampled, his small body bruised and battered by the hooves of the livestock, compounding the injuries to his face. And as if the animal kingdom hadn't done enough to try and snuff out this spark of life, he was struck down by smallpox. The disease, the great scourge of the 18th century, ravaged his skin. It boiled and blistered, leaving his face deeply pitted, cratered like the surface of a moon. By the time he was a teenager, the transformation was complete. He looked like a brawler, a brute with a massive head, a thick neck, and a face that looked like it had been chiseled out of granite by a clumsy, angry sculptor. This physical hideousness is not a trivial detail. It is the key to his psychology. Imagine growing up in a world that values refinement and beauty, looking like a monster. He learned early on that he could not charm the world with a smile. He had to conquer it with force. He developed a physical presence that was overwhelming. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and possessed an athletic vitality that bordered on the animalistic. He was a force of nature, bursting with energy, often violent in his play, dominating the other boys in Arcis, not through cruelty, but through sheer, unstoppable exuberance. Yet trapped inside this monstrous exterior was a mind of startling sharpness and a laziness that was almost legendary. He was a paradox even then. He hated studying, he hated paperwork, and he possessed a deep, abiding love for doing absolutely nothing. He would cut classes to swim in the Aube River, spending hours floating on his back, watching the clouds, soaking in the sensory pleasures of the world. He loved the feel of the water, the taste of good food, the warmth of the sun. He was a creature of the senses. Unlike his future rival Robespierre, who lived in his head, Danton lived in his body. He understood the visceral reality of life, but when he did speak, the laziness vanished. Even as a boy, he discovered he possessed a weapon more powerful than any sword: his voice. It was described as a tocsin, an alarm bell, deep, resonant, and capable of filling a public square without effort. It was a voice that seemed to rumble up from the earth itself, a basso profundo that commanded attention. He learned that when he spoke, people stopped staring at his scars and started listening to his words. He learned to use his ugliness as a prop, a way to intimidate, while his voice seduced. He studied law, not out of passion, but out of necessity. It was the family trade, the path of least resistance. He was sent away to school, eventually making his way to Paris in 1780. The Paris that Danton entered was not yet the city of the guillotine. It was the Paris of the Enlightenment, a city teeming with ideas, contradictions, and a simmering invisible energy. It was a city of mud and gold. He arrived as a young man with no connections, just his law degree and his colossal ambition. He worked as a clerk, copying documents, a task he loathed with every fiber of his being. He would often sneak away to the cafes of the Palais Royal, the epicenter of gossip and sedition, where he would drink cheap wine and listen to the intellectuals debate the nature of liberty. By 1787, through charm, borrowing money, and sheer force of personality, he managed to purchase a position as a lawyer in the King's Council. This was a significant achievement. It was a respectable job, one that placed him firmly in the upper middle class. It allowed him to wear the robe, to argue cases, and to make a name for himself. He was a successful lawyer, known for his powerful oratory rather than his legal scholarship. He won cases by overwhelming the opposition, by turning dry legal disputes into emotional battles. It was during this time that he found the one thing that could tame his restless spirit: Antoinette Gabrielle Charpentier. She was the daughter of a wealthy cafe owner, the proprietor of the Café Parnasse. Gabrielle was everything Danton was not. She was beautiful in a quiet, serene way. She was pious, conservative, and deeply domestic. She provided the anchor for his storm-tossed soul. He adored her. For a man who looked like a brute, Danton was capable of profound tenderness. They married, and with her dowry and his income, they set up a comfortable home in the Cour du Commerce, a cobbled alleyway in the Latin Quarter. They had children. They had a home filled with good furniture, books, and the smell of rich cooking. For a moment, it looked like Georges-Jacques Danton would settle into the life of a comfortable, albeit ugly, bourgeois lawyer. He could have lived out his days arguing property disputes, eating heavy dinners, and playing with his sons. He could have been a footnote in local records. But the ground beneath Paris was shifting. The tectonic plates of history were grinding together. The year 1789 arrived, and with it, the collapse of the old world. The winter had been harsh, the harvest had failed, and the people were starving. The price of bread skyrocketed. The tension in the air was palpable, like the static electricity before a thunderstorm. When the Estates General was called, Danton did not initially stand for election. He watched. He waited. But when the Bastille fell on July 14th, Danton didn't just watch. He inhaled the chaos. While other revolutionaries like Robespierre were writing meticulous speeches in quiet rooms, debating the finer points of constitutional monarchy, Danton was on the street corners. He realized immediately that the power was not in the halls of Versailles, but in the muddy, angry streets of Paris. He found his stage at the Cordelier Club, a radical gathering place in one of the grittiest districts of the city. The Cordeliers district was a maze of narrow streets, filled with printers, actors, butchers, and the working poor. It was the beating heart of radical Paris. This was Danton's natural habitat. He wasn't an intellectual elitist. He was the Mirabeau of the populace. He didn't care about abstract virtue. He cared about action. When he spoke to the crowds at the Cordeliers, seated in an old monastery, he didn't talk down to them. He roared, he swore, he sweated. He unbuttoned his collar, his massive neck bulging as he shouted against the injustices of the aristocracy. He was physically imposing, and his energy was infectious. He became the champion of the passive citizens, the poor, who were being left out of the new voting laws. The early revolution wanted to give the vote only to men with property. Danton looked at the butchers and the tanners of his district and argued that if you were French, you had rights, regardless of how much tax you paid. "You have cleared the ground," he shouted to the assembly, "but you have not yet sowed the seeds of liberty." His rise was meteoric. He became the president of the Cordelier district. He was the man you went to if you wanted something done. He could organize a protest, stop a riot, or start one with a snap of his fingers. But with power came the whispers. Where was he getting his money? Danton lived well. Too well for a man with no steady income during a revolution that had halted most legal proceedings. He ate well, he drank expensive Burgundy, and rumors swirled that he was taking bribes. His enemies whispered that he was on the payroll of the Duke of Orleans, the king's cousin who was plotting to steal the throne. Others said he was taking money from the king's own agents to try and control the radical crowds. The truth remains one of history's murky corners. Danton was a pragmatist. He likely took money from everyone. He was a man of enormous appetites, and appetites cost money. As he famously quipped later, a man like him could be bought, but he could never be sold. He took their gold, but he followed his own compass. He used the money to fund the revolution, to support his friends, and yes, to buy good wine. He did not see a contradiction in being a revolutionary and enjoying life. As 1790 and 1791 bled by, the revolution grew more radical, and Danton grew with it. He began to see that the constitutional monarchy was a sham. The king was not to be trusted. The flight of the king to Varennes in 1791 proved him right. The royal family had tried to escape France to join the foreign armies. The mask had slipped. Danton's voice grew louder, darker. He began to speak not just of reform, but of a republic. He was moving toward the center of the storm, positioning himself as the one man who could bridge the gap between the chaotic violence of the street mobs and the intellectual rigor of the politicians. He was the conduit, but the storm that was coming would be unlike anything he or anyone else could have imagined. The days of speeches were ending. The days of blood were about to begin. As the calendar turned, the simmering energy of the streets began to boil over, transforming the intellectual debates of the cafes into a desperate struggle for survival. Danton had mastered the art of the spoken word, but words were no longer enough. The revolution he had helped ignite was about to demand a price in blood that no lawyer could negotiate. The time for theory was dead. The time for the Titan to rise from the mud was at hand. The summer of 1792 in Paris was not merely a season, it was a fever dream. The air hung heavy and humid, thick with the smell of rotting garbage and the sharper metallic scent of fear. The revolution, which had begun with the hopeful, almost naive idealism of 1789, had curdled into paranoia. The king, Louis XVI, was still technically the head of state, but he was a prisoner in his own palace, the Tuileries, watched by the suspicious eyes of the National Guard. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, was hated with a virulence that defies modern comprehension, labeled an Austrian wolf, conspiring to bathe Paris in the blood of patriots. And for once, the paranoia was justified. On the borders of France, the armies of the Old World were gathering. The Prussians, the most disciplined killing machine in Europe, and the Austrians were marching west. Their goal was simple: destroy the revolution, hang the rebels, and restore Louis to his absolute power. In late July, the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the invading forces, issued a manifesto that would seal the fate of the French monarchy. He warned the people of Paris that if a single hair on the king's head was touched, he would burn the city to the ground and subject its citizens to military execution. It was meant to terrify the Parisians into submission. Instead, it enraged them. It was the spark that landed in the powder keg of the Cordelier district, and the man holding the match was Georges Danton. Danton spent these sweltering weeks in a frenzy of activity. While Robespierre was cautious, fearing that a premature insurrection would lead to a massacre of the people, Danton was gambling everything on chaos. He had returned to his hometown of Arches briefly in early August, perhaps to say goodbye to his mother or to secure his family's finances, sensing that death was near. He gave all his money to his mother, telling her, "If I die, this is for you. If I live, I won't need it." He returned to Paris on the eve of the storm, ready to direct the lightning. The night of August 9th, 1792, was the death watch of the French monarchy. The bells of the churches began to ring, the tocsin, the sound of emergency. Danton was at the Cordeliers Club, the epicenter of the insurrection. The plan was an open secret. The people of Paris, the sans-culottes, the workers, the shopkeepers, the men with pikes and rusty muskets, would march on the Tuileries Palace and physically remove the king. Danton's exact role on the night of August 10th is debated by historians, but his presence looms over it like a shadow. He didn't lead the charge himself. He was too valuable, or perhaps too pragmatic, to be in the first wave of cannon fodder. Instead, he was the engine room. He was at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, helping to overthrow the legal municipal government and replace it with a radical insurrectionary commune. He was ensuring that when the sun rose, the mob would have legal authority. He famously told the insurrectionists, "To arms, to arms. You must save yourselves, for no one else will." When dawn broke on August 10th, the Tuileries was a slaughterhouse. The king and his family had fled to the safety of the Legislative Assembly just minutes before the firing started. The Swiss guards, loyal to their oath, stood their ground against 20,000 furious Parisians. They fired into the crowd, mowing down hundreds, but the sheer weight of numbers overwhelmed them. The palace was stormed. The Swiss were hacked to pieces, their bodies mutilated and thrown from windows, their red uniforms staining the palace courtyards. It was a massacre, a chaotic explosion of 3 years of pent-up rage. When the smoke cleared, the monarchy was dead. Louis XVI was suspended and imprisoned in the Temple, a gloomy medieval fortress. The Legislative Assembly, terrified by the violence of the mob and the power of the new commune, looked for a man who could bridge the gap between the government and the streets. They needed someone the mob trusted, but someone who could also speak the language of power. They turned to Danton. Overnight, the street agitator became the Minister of Justice. It was an astonishing ascent. He walked into the ministry at the Place Vendôme, a building of marble and velvet, still wearing the dust of the Revolution. He looked entirely out of place among the refined bureaucrats. He was loud, he was unkempt, and he brought his cronies with him, Camille Desmoulins, Fabre d'Églantine, men of talent but little discipline. Danton famously said to them, "We are the rabble. We have to show these gentlemen that we are capable of governing. But there was no time for celebration. The situation was catastrophic. The fall of the monarchy had paralyzed the army's leadership. Lafayette, the general of the armies, fled France in disgust. The frontier fortresses were falling like dominoes. Longwy fell on August 23rd. Verdun, the last major fortress protecting the road to Paris, was under siege and would fall on September 2nd. The road to the capital was open. The Prussians were coming, and they were bringing the Gallows with them. Panic seized Paris. The government was in shambles. The Girondins, the moderate faction leading the assembly, were packing their bags, preparing to flee the capital and set up a provisional government in the south of France. They believed Paris was lost. Roland, the minister of the Interior, was pale with fear. This was Danton's finest hour. In a room full of trembling men, he was a rock. When the other ministers spoke of fleeing, Danton slammed his massive fist on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. He looked at them with his small, fierce eyes and roared that fleeing would be treason. "France is in Paris," he bellowed. "If you abandon Paris, you abandon France." He understood the psychology of the moment. The people didn't need strategy. They needed hope. They needed raw, unadulterated courage. On the morning of September 2nd, with the news of Verdun's imminent fall circulating through the terrified streets, Danton went to the Legislative Assembly. He climbed the rostrum, his huge frame dominating the room. He didn't use notes. He didn't use flowery Latin phrases. He spoke from the gut. His voice boomed, filling every corner of the hall, shaking the dust from the rafters. He told them that the enemy was not invincible. He told them that the ringing bells were not a signal of defeat, but a call to charge. And then he delivered the line that would be carved into his statue and into the history books. "To conquer them, gentlemen, we must dare, dare again, always dare, and France is saved." It was electric. It was a transfusion of adrenaline into a dying patient. The assembly rose to its feet in a thunderous ovation. Men wept. Enlistment stations were set up in the streets, and thousands of young men, inspired by Danton's fury, signed up to march east and face the Prussian cannons with nothing but pikes and enthusiasm. He had single-handedly mobilized the nation. But here the story takes its darkest turn. Here enters the paradox. At the exact moment Danton was playing the hero, inspiring the troops to the front, a cancerous tumor of fear was growing in the belly of Paris. A rumor started, no one knows exactly where, that as soon as the volunteers left for the front, the royalist prisoners in the Paris jails would break out. They would arm themselves, burn the city, and slaughter the wives and children left behind. It was a conspiracy theory born of pure hysteria, but in the overheated atmosphere of 1792, it was taken as gospel. The radical press, led by the bloodthirsty Jean-Paul Marat, screamed for preventative measures. Marat urged the people to go to the prisons and shorten the enemies of the people by a head. Danton was the minister of justice. He was the guardian of the law. The prisons were under his jurisdiction. He knew the rumors. He heard the drums beating for blood, and he did nothing. On the afternoon of September 2nd, while Danton's voice was still ringing in the assembly, gangs of sans-culottes, butchers, tradesmen, National Guardsmen, gathered at the prisons. They set up improvised tribunals. They dragged prisoners out of their cells. Priests who refused to swear allegiance to the state, former aristocrats, the Queen's lady-in-waiting, the Princesse de Lamballe. They asked them a few cursory questions and then shoved them out into the courtyards where men with axes, pikes, and wooden clubs were waiting. The September massacres were an orgy of brutality. For 5 days the slaughter continued. The streets literally ran red with blood. The Princesse de Lamballe was stripped, gang-raped, and hacked to death, her head stuck on a pike and paraded beneath the Queen's window at the Temple prison. Over 1,200 people were murdered. Many were not even political prisoners. They were common criminals, prostitutes, and street urchins unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. Where was Danton? He was in his office. He was at the theater. He was having dinner. When an inspector from the prisons, Grand Pré, rushed to Danton to beg him to intervene, to send the National Guard to stop the butchery, Danton looked at him with cold, heavy eyes. He reportedly shrugged his massive shoulders and growled, "I don't give a damn about the prisoners. Let them fend for themselves." Later, when another official asked him to stop it, he famously replied, "No human power can stop the people's vengeance." Why? How could the man who just saved France allow this? This is the cold calculus of Danton. He believed that the government was too weak to stop the mob. If he tried to use the army to stop the massacres, the mob would turn on the government and the revolution would collapse into civil war just as the Prussians were arriving. He chose to sacrifice the prisoners to save the revolution. He viewed it as a necessary evil, a bloodletting that would satisfy the rage of the people so they would then be willing to march to the front. The people want to terrify their enemies. He would later rationalize, "Let us be terrible so the people do not have to be." It was a monstrous political gamble, and in a horrifying way, it worked. The city was purged of its internal enemies. The rage was sated, and the volunteers marched out of Paris with a clear mind to fight the Prussians. On September 20th, at the Battle of Valmy, this ragtag army of tailors and lawyers stood their ground against the professional Prussian army. They didn't run. They shouted "Vive la Nation" and held the line. The Prussians, stunned by this fanaticism, retreated. The revolution was saved, but the price was Danton's soul. The blood of September would stain him forever. It was the original sin of the First Republic. The Girondins, the moderates in the Assembly, would never forgive him. They saw him as the god of the Septembrists, a man who ruled through murder. They began to attack him relentlessly, accusing him of dictatorship, of corruption, of stealing funds from the Ministry of Justice during the chaos. Danton resigned his ministry in October to take a seat in the new National Convention. He was now the most famous man in France, a hero to the streets, a monster to the moderates. He sat high up on the benches on the left side of the hall, leading the radical faction known as the Mountain. But he was already tired. The strain of the summer, the weight of the blood he had allowed to spill, was heavy on him. He wanted the revolution to end. He wanted to go home to Gabriel, to his children, to the countryside. He wanted to build a republic of laws, not of lynch mobs, but he had unleashed forces that he could no longer control. He had taught the people that violence was a legitimate political tool. He had shown them that if they wanted something, they could just take it with a pike. As the winter of 1792 approached, a new question loomed, one that would divide the nation and force Danton into yet another impossible choice. What to do with the king? The monarch was a prisoner, stripped of his crown, now just citizen Louis Capet. The radicals wanted his head. The moderates wanted to spare him. Danton, the pragmatist, the man who just wanted the war to end, found himself caught in the middle, pushed forward by the very current he had helped create. The tocsin had stopped ringing, but the sound of the tumbrils, the carts of the executioner, was just beginning to be heard in the distance. With the Prussians repelled and the immediate threat of annihilation silenced, the adrenaline that had sustained Paris began to curdle into a cold, bitter resolve. The September massacres had saved the city, but they had also stained the soul of the Republic. Now the beast that Danton had helped unleash turned its hungry gaze inward, looking for new enemies closer to home. The heat of the summer battles faded, replaced by a chilling winter wind that whispered of judgment, not for the invaders, but for the king himself. The winter of 1793 descended upon Paris like a shroud. The euphoria of the victory at Valmy had faded, replaced by a grim, freezing reality. The Seine was choked with ice, bread was scarce, and the mood in the National Convention was venomous. The question of Louis XVI hung over the Assembly, a sword of Damocles that threatened to split the fragile republic in two. To the moderates, the Girondins executing the king was a step too far, a barbarism that would invite the wrath of every monarch in Europe. To the radicals of the mountain, the king was a breathing symbol of tyranny. As long as he lived, the republic could never truly be safe. Danton once again found himself walking a razor's edge. In his heart, he had no desire to kill Louis. He saw the king as a useful pawn, a hostage to be traded for peace with Austria and Prussia. He spent weeks in backroom dealings, meeting with foreign diplomats, hinting that he could save the monarch's life if the invading armies withdrew. He was a pragmatic gambler, willing to trade a head for a treaty. But the tide of history was moving too fast for backroom deals. The discovery of the iron chest, a secret safe in the Tuileries, containing proof of the king's correspondence with the enemy, destroyed any chance of mercy. When the vote was finally called in January 1793, the atmosphere in the convention was suffocating. The galleries were packed with the sans-culottes, drinking wine, eating sausages, and jeering at any deputy who spoke of mercy. One by one, the deputies climbed the podium to cast their vote, life or death. When Danton's turn came, he looked at the crowd, then at his fellow deputies. He knew that to vote for life now would be political suicide. It would brand him a royalist sympathizer and strip him of his power to guide the revolution. So the man who wanted to save the king stepped up and delivered the death blow. "The coalized kings threaten us," he thundered, his voice cracking like a whip. "We hurl at their feet as a gauge of battle, the head of a king." He voted for death without delay. It was a cold, calculated move. He sacrificed the man to save the politician. On January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was guillotined in the Place de la Révolution. The blade fell, the cannons fired, and the world changed. France was now at war with virtually all of Europe. The bridges were burned. There was no going back. But just as Danton secured his political survival, his personal world collapsed with a violence that nearly destroyed him. In February 1793, he was sent on a mission to Belgium to organize the annexed territories. He left behind his wife Gabrielle, who was heavily pregnant with their fourth child. Gabrielle was his conscience. In the swirling madness of the revolution, she was the one quiet place where he could just be a man, not a titan. She anchored him. While he was in Belgium, immersed in the gritty details of army logistics, a courier arrived from Paris with news that brought the giant to his knees. Gabrielle had died giving birth to a son, who also died shortly after. She was already buried. The grief that seized Danton was not the polite mourning of the 18th century. It was a primal, terrifying madness. He abandoned his post. He rode nonstop back to Paris, driving his horses to the brink of collapse, his face a mask of agony. He arrived at his home in the Cour du Commerce to find it silent. The furniture was there, her scent was still on the linens, but the warmth was gone. He could not accept it. The finality of death, which he had dispensed so casually to others, was suddenly unacceptable when it touched him. In a scene that belongs to the darkest pages of Gothic literature, Danton went to the cemetery of Saint-André-des-Arts in the middle of the night. He brought men with shovels. He ordered them to dig. He stood in the flickering torchlight, the shadows dancing on his scarred face, watching as the earth was removed. When the coffin was exposed, he ordered it opened. He dragged the decaying body of his beloved Gabriel out of the wood. He embraced her cold, stiff form, weeping uncontrollably, screaming his grief into the silent night. He covered her dead face with kisses, begging her to forgive him, begging her to come back. It was grotesque, it was horrific, and it was heartbreakingly human. He ordered a sculptor to make a plaster cast of her face right there by the gravesite, so that he would never forget the contours of her features. He kept that bust for the rest of his life, a shrine to the only purity he had ever known. This encounter with mortality changed him. When he returned to the convention, he was a haunted man. He seemed older, heavier. The fire in his eyes had dimmed, replaced by a weary cynicism. He had looked into the abyss, and the petty squabbles of the politicians now seemed absurd to him. He was sick of blood. He was sick of the endless speeches about virtue. He wanted peace. He wanted to stop the machine, but the machine was hungry. The war was going badly. The French general Dumouriez, a friend of Danton, deserted to the Austrians, taking the army's secrets with him. Panic swept Paris once again. The cry of treason rang out. The people demanded a government that could punish traitors swiftly, without the slow deliberation of the courts. They wanted a weapon to fight the internal enemy. Danton, despite his grief, or perhaps because of it, realized that if the government didn't organize the terror, the people would return to the chaotic street massacres of September. He remembered the blood on his hands from that summer, and he wanted to prevent it from happening again. He proposed the creation of a new body, the Revolutionary Tribunal. It was to be a special court designed to try counter-revolutionaries quickly and efficiently. When a moderate deputy protested that this was a return to tyranny, Danton rose to his feet. His voice was no longer the boom of a conqueror, but the gravelly growl of a man who knew the darkness of the human heart. Nothing is more difficult to define than political crime, he argued. But he insisted the court was necessary. "Let us be terrible," he famously said, "so that the people do not have to be." He believed he was building a dam to control the flood of violence. He believed he was creating a controlled flame to prevent an inferno. He did not realize in his grief and exhaustion that he was building the very scaffold that would claim his own life. He also helped establish the Committee of Public Safety, a small group of men given dictatorial powers to run the war effort. He was its first leader. For a few months, Danton was the de facto dictator of France, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. He showed up late to meetings. He left early to go for walks along the Seine. He sought solace in the countryside. He lacked the ruthless administrative stamina required to run a war government. And waiting in the wings, watching Danton's lethargy with calculating eyes, was Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre was the anti-Danton. Where Danton was loud, physical, and corrupt, Robespierre was quiet, frail, and incorruptible. Where Danton loved wine, women, and laughter, Robespierre lived on bread, water, and virtue. Robespierre worked 18 hours a day, obsessing over every detail, every decree, every potential traitor. He began to whisper that Danton was soft, that his lack of zeal was a danger to the Republic. In the summer of 1793, the coup happened, not with guns, but with votes. Danton was voted off the Committee of Public Safety. Robespierre was voted in. The era of Danton, the era of chaotic energy and pragmatic deals, was over. The era of Robespierre, the era of icy logic and the Great Terror had begun. Danton should have fought back. He had the popularity, he had the voice, But he did something that shocked everyone. He walked away. He retired. And then he did something even more shocking. 4 months after digging up his dead wife, he remarried. He married Louise Sébastienne Gély, a girl of 16. She was the daughter of a minor admiralty official, a friend of the family. She was young, fresh, and deeply religious. She insisted on a Catholic wedding. The Catholic Church was currently being persecuted. Priests who hadn't sworn loyalty to the state were being hunted down. Yet Danton, the great revolutionary, the founder of the atheist republic, agreed. He found a nonjuring priest, a man hiding in a garret, and married the young girl in a secret, illegal ceremony. It was the ultimate hypocrisy and the ultimate admission of what he really wanted. He didn't want a revolution anymore. He wanted a normal life. He wanted to play with his new wife, to bounce his children on his knee, to retreat to his farm in Arcis-sur-Aube and forget that Paris existed. He took his young bride and left the capital. For months, while the terror ramped up in Paris, while the Queen was put on trial, while the Girondins were dragged to the guillotine, Danton was walking in the woods of Champagne. He was planting trees. He was laughing. He told his friends, "I have had my fill of men. I want nothing more to do with politics. Let them kill each other if they wish." He thought he was safe. He thought he was too big to touch. He was the Titan, the man of August 10th. Who would dare strike Danton? He believed that his legend was a shield. But in Paris, Robespierre sat in his small room at the Duplay house, adjusting his spectacles, reading reports of Danton's secret wealth, his leniency, his lack of virtue. Robespierre was coming to the conclusion that for the Republic of Virtue to be born, the vices of Danton had to be purged. But a man who has tasted the raw power of shaping history cannot remain content with the quiet rustle of trees and the embrace of a young wife. While Danton tried to bury himself in domestic peace, the silence of the countryside became deafening, broken only by the frantic letters arriving from a capital drowning in madness. He told himself he was done, that he was safe. But deep down, the Titan knew that the revolution does not allow for retirement. The lion was sleeping in the grass, dreaming of peace, unaware that the hunters were already loading their muskets. The autumn of 1793 found Georges Danton in a state of restless exile. In the quiet, damp woodlands of Arcis-sur-Aube, far from the screeching of the Parisian mob, he tried to play the role of the retired gentleman. He walked his dogs, he inspected his property, and he spent long evenings by the fire with his young wife, Louise. He was recovering his health, his skin clearing slightly, his massive frame relaxing away from the constant adrenaline of the convention. But silence, for a man like Danton, was not peace, it was a vacuum. He was a creature of noise and friction, and while the countryside offered safety, Paris offered immortality. Every courier who arrived from the capital brought news that smelled of blood. The terror was no longer a temporary measure. It had become a system of government. The guillotine at the Place de la Révolution was claiming dozens of lives a week. The definition of suspect was widening to include almost anyone, those who had done nothing against the revolution, but also those who had done nothing for it. His oldest friends, led by the brilliant but erratic journalist Camille Desmoulins, began to send frantic letters. They told Danton that the Republic was being devoured by its own children. They told him of the Heretists, the ultra-radicals led by Jacques Hébert, who were demanding the de-Christianization of France, the destruction of churches, and more heads, always more heads. They told him that Robespierre was balancing between the extremes, but the machinery of death was spinning out of control. "Come back, Danton," Desmoulins wrote. "We need your voice. We need the thunder to drown out the madness." Danton hesitated. He knew that returning to Paris was walking back into the lion's den. He knew Robespierre's eyes were watching everything. But Danton possessed a fatal flaw, a colossal vanity mixed with a strange fatalism. He believed he was the revolution. He believed that without him the whole structure would collapse, and perhaps he simply missed the game. In late November 1793, the Titan returned. He did not creep back into the city. He arrived like a storm front. He immediately took his seat in the convention and threw his weight behind Robespierre. Initially, they had a common enemy, the Hebertists. These ultra-radicals were embarrassing the revolution with their atheistic masquerades and their bloodlust. Danton and Robespierre, the two giants, briefly aligned to crush them. Danton roared from the podium, demanding an end to the masquerades against religion, arguing for a return to order. With Danton's support, Robespierre destroyed the Hebertists. Their leaders were arrested and guillotined in March 1794. The ultras were gone. But now the board was cleared. Only two factions remained: the Committee of Public Safety, led by the icy, incorruptible Robespierre, and the Indulgents, led by Danton and Desmoulins. The conflict was inevitable. It was a clash of two fundamental philosophies of human nature. Robespierre believed that the purpose of the revolution was to create a republic of virtue. He believed that terror was necessary to purge the country of corruption. To him, mercy was a weakness, a crime against the future. Danton, on the other hand, believed the revolution had won. The foreign armies had been pushed back. The internal rebellions had been crushed. The emergency was over. He wanted the terror to stop. He wanted a committee of clemency. He wanted the prisons opened. He believed that a republic built on piles of headless corpses was no republic at all. "I would rather be guillotined than be a guillotiner," he told a friend. He unleashed Camille Desmoulins. The young journalist published a new newspaper, Le Vieux Cordelier. It was a masterpiece of political satire. In it, Desmoulins didn't attack Robespierre directly, not yet. Instead, he wrote about the Roman Empire, describing the tyranny of the Caesars, where silence was a crime and grief was a crime. Everyone knew he was talking about Paris. The paper sold out instantly. People fought in the streets to buy copies. It was the first breath of fresh air, the first public call for mercy in a year. Robespierre read the paper and saw it for what it was, a direct threat to his power. If the people started demanding mercy, the government's grip would loosen. Robespierre, the man who had once been Danton's friend, the man who had signed the marriage contract for Danton's first wedding, began to take notes. He began to compile a dossier. The whispers began. Robespierre's allies, particularly the fanatic Saint-Just, began to spread poison. They whispered that Danton was corrupt. Where did he get his money? They whispered that he had tried to save the king. They whispered that his call for mercy was just a cover to save his royalist friends in prison. Danton laughed it off. He was overconfident. He spent his nights at the opera or dining at the Palais Royal, surrounded by admirers. He would loudly crack jokes about Robespierre's virginity, his lack of balls, his constipation. "Robespierre," he would bellow, wine in hand, "he is not capable of cooking an egg." He treated Robespierre as a nuisance, a pedantic schoolmaster who just needed to be shouted down. He underestimated the schoolmaster. In mid-March 1794, the two men met for the last time. It was a private dinner, arranged by mutual friends hoping to avoid a collision. The atmosphere was tense. Danton, flushed with wine, tried to be conciliatory. He grabbed Robespierre, tried to hug him, tried to use his physical warmth to melt the ice. He urged Robespierre to stop the killing, to enjoy the victory. We should not strike except where it is useful to the Republic, Danton said. Robespierre, stiff and recoiling from Danton's touch, replied coldly, "Who told you that one innocent man has perished?" Danton was stunned. He turned to the others in the room, a bitter sneer on his lip. "What do you say? Not one innocent man has perished?" The gap was unbridgeable. As Danton left, he reportedly muttered, "We hold the tail of the tiger." The trap was set. On March 30th, the Committees of Public Safety and General Security met in a secret session. Saint-Just, the angel of death, read a report he had drafted. It was a tissue of lies, half-truths, and twisted facts, weaving a narrative that Danton had been a traitor from the very beginning, a sleeper agent of the monarchy, a man who had sold the revolution for gold. Robespierre sat silently, signing the warrant. He had hesitated for days, but once he decided, he was implacable. Danton must die so the Republic can live, was the logic. Rumors of the arrest warrant leaked immediately. That evening, Danton was at his home in the Cour du Commerce. Friends rushed in, pale and breathless. "They are coming for you, Danton. You must flee. The road to the coast is open." Danton sat by the fire, poking the logs with a heavy iron poker. He looked at his friends with weary, heavy eyes. He refused to move. "One does not carry one's country on the soles of one's shoes," he famously replied. It was a line of tragic poetry. He meant that a man like him could not live in exile. He was French. He was the soil of France. To leave was to die anyway. "Besides," he added with a flash of his old arrogance, "they will not dare." He went to bed. He slept soundly, the sleep of a man who has surrendered to fate. At dawn on March 31st, the heavy boots of the National Guard thudded on the cobblestones of the Cour du Commerce. They pounded on the door. Danton opened it himself. He kissed his wife goodbye, told her not to cry, and surrendered. Camille Desmoulins was arrested the same night, dragged from his weeping wife and infant son. They were taken to the Luxembourg prison. When Danton arrived, the other prisoners, aristocrats, royalists, the very people Danton had terrorized, stared in shock. The jailer, flustered by having such a famous guest, apologized for the lack of a proper cell. "It doesn't matter," Danton laughed grimly. "I won't be here long." As he walked through the prison corridors, he saw Thomas Paine, the American revolutionary who had been imprisoned. Danton stopped and said, "I instituted the Revolutionary Tribunal. I asked pardon of God and of men. My purpose was to prevent a new September massacre, not to unleash a scourge on humanity." It was a confession. He knew what was coming. The tribunal he had created, the machine he had built to be terrible, was now waiting for him. The news of Danton's arrest hit Paris like a thunderclap. The shops closed. The people gathered in small, frightened knots. Danton? Arrested? If Danton could be arrested, then no one was safe. In the convention, the deputies sat in terrified silence. For a moment it seemed they might revolt against Robespierre. But Robespierre took the podium. He stared them down. "I say that whoever trembles at this moment is guilty," he warned them. "For innocence never fears the public scrutiny." The deputies, fearing for their own heads, lowered their eyes. They voted to put Danton on trial. The lion was in the cage. Now the spectacle would begin. The arrest of the century had shocked the city into a paralyzed silence, but Danton had no intention of going quietly into the night. He knew that the tribunal was a rigged game, a machine he himself had designed to crush resistance, yet he viewed it not as a death sentence, but as a stage. The cage doors were locked, the warrant was signed, and Robespierre believed the danger was past. He was wrong. The lion was in the cage, yes, but he had one final roar left, a roar loud enough to shake the very foundations of the government. The trial of Georges-Jacques Danton, which began on April 2, 1794, was never intended to be a judicial proceeding. It was a political exorcism. The Revolutionary Tribunal, the very machine Danton had created to be terrible so the people do not have to be, was now turned against its maker with a grim, ironic efficiency. But the Committee of Public Safety had made a critical miscalculation. They assumed Danton would be a passive victim, a man crushed by the weight of his own corruption. They forgot that when you back a lion into a corner, he does not cower, he attacks. From the moment he entered the courtroom, Danton dominated the space. The Palace of Justice was packed to the rafters. The air was stifling, smelling of unwashed bodies and nervous sweat. People had queued since dawn, desperate to see the Titan fall. Danton was paraded in with a motley group of co-defendants. To humiliate him, the prosecution had used a tactic called the amalgam. They lumped Danton and Desmoulins, political giants, together with common thieves, forgers, and swindlers like Chabot and Frey. The visual message was clear. There is no difference between a traitor and a crook. But Danton refused to play the role of the criminal. When the court clerk, following the standard procedure, asked him his name and address, Danton did not mumble. He threw his head back, his scarred face catching the light, and roared a response that silenced the murmuring crowd. My name is Danton, a name tolerably well known in the Revolution. My abode will soon be in annihilation, but I shall live in the pantheon of history. The prosecutor was Antoine Quentin Fouquier-Tinville, a man with thin lips, dead eyes, and a soul made of bureaucracy. He read the charges. Danton was accused of conspiring with the Duke of Orléans, of trying to restore the monarchy, of stealing public funds, of being too lenient, of being too rich. It was a blizzard of contradictions. Danton listened, his massive arms crossed, a look of utter contempt on his face. When he was finally allowed to speak, the courtroom exploded. Danton didn't just defend himself, he put the government on trial. He demanded that his accusers, Robespierre, Saint-Just, Vadier, come out from their hiding places and face him. Let the cowards who accuse me show their faces, he bellowed. His voice, that legendary instrument of the Revolution, was so powerful that it reportedly rang out through the open windows, crossed the Seine, and could be heard by crowds gathering on the Quai de la Mégisserie, on the other side of the river. He recounted his service. I am the man of August 10th, he shouted. I am the man who roused the nation when the Prussians were at the gates, and you accuse me of betraying the Republic? I am the Republic. The effect was electrifying. The jurors, handpicked to convict him, began to waver. The crowd in the gallery, which was supposed to jeer him, began to cheer. Danton was winning. He was turning the trial into a riot. For 3 days he battered the prosecution. Fouquier-Tinville was terrified. He sent panic-stricken notes to Robespierre and the committee. The accused is exciting the people. The trial is turning against us. We need a way to stop his mouth. Robespierre and Saint-Just, watching from the shadows, realized that if Danton kept talking, the government would fall. They needed a weapon to silence him, a gag that looked like a law. Saint-Just, cold and beautiful as a marble statue, rushed to the National Convention. He lied. He told the terrified deputies that the prisoners were plotting a revolt, that Danton's wife was distributing money to the mob to storm the court. He proposed a new decree. Any prisoner who insulted justice or showed disrespect to the court could be silenced and removed from the proceedings. The convention, paralyzed by fear, passed the decree. The next morning, April 4th, when Danton rose to continue his devastating defense, the decree was read aloud. He was stunned. He looked at the judges with wide, disbelief-filled eyes. You are refusing to hear witnesses? he asked. "You are refusing to let us speak?" "The law is clear," the judge replied. Danton went purple with rage. He grabbed the railing of the dock, shaking it until it creaked. "They are murdering us," he shouted to the crowd. "People of France, they are judging us without a hearing. It is not a trial, it is a slaughter." But the guards moved in. The indulgents, Danton, Desmoulins, and their friends, were dragged from the courtroom, shouting curses at the tyranny of the committee. The jury, now relieved of the pressure of Danton's presence, deliberated briefly. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Guilty. Death. The morning of April 5th, 1794, was beautiful. Spring had arrived in Paris. Lilacs were blooming in the gardens, unaware that the grim harvest of the guillotine was about to take place. In the Conciergerie prison, Danton and his friends prepared for the end. Camille Desmoulins was falling apart. He was crying, tearing his clothes, screaming the name of his beloved wife, Lucille. Danton was the rock. He went to Desmoulins, put a heavy arm around his shoulders, and spoke with a rough tenderness. "Be quiet, Camille," he said. "Don't let the rabble see you cry. We must show them how to die." At 4 p.m., the executioner, Charles-Henri Sanson, arrived to cut their hair and bind their hands. When Sanson approached Danton, the giant sat quietly. He made one request, a flash of his old humor. "You can bind my hands, but you cannot stop our heads from kissing in the basket." They were loaded into the red-painted tumbrils, the carts that carried the condemned. The journey from the prison to the Place de la Révolution took over an hour. The streets were lined with thousands of people. These were the same people who had cheered Danton in 1792, the same people he had fed and defended. Now they watched in silence. Danton stood tall in the cart. He was a terrifying figure. His shirt was open at the neck, revealing his thick chest. His face, red and scarred, looked like a mask of fury. He did not look down. He looked the crowd in the eye, daring them to judge him. As the cart rumbled down the Rue Saint-Honoré, it passed the house of the carpenter Duplay, the house where Robespierre lived. The shutters were closed tight. Robespierre was hiding inside, unable to watch his friend pass. Danton knew he was there. He strained against his ropes, turned his massive head toward the shuttered windows, and roared a prophecy that would chill the blood of everyone who heard it. "Robespierre, you will follow me. Your house will be razed to the ground. I drag you down with me." It was the curse of a dying Titan, and it was true. When they reached the scaffold, the sun was setting, casting a long blood-red light over the city. The blade of the guillotine glinted high above. One by one, his friends were executed. Desmoulins went up, still weeping, clutching a lock of Lucille's hair. Danton was the last. He had to stand in the slick blood of his friends, listening to the thud-hiss-thud of the blade 14 times before it was his turn. For a brief second, his composure cracked. He thought of his young wife, Louise, alone in the countryside. "Oh, my beloved," he cried out, "shall I never see you again?" Then, realizing he was showing weakness, he shook himself like a wet dog and growled, "Come, Danton, no weakness." He climbed the steps. The wood was slippery. He walked up to Sanson. He did not ask for mercy. He did not pray. He looked at the executioner with an arrogant, knowing smirk. He knew that his death was the end of the revolution's heart, and he wanted to make sure the world knew it. "Don't forget to show my head to the people," he commanded, his voice steady and deep. "It is well worth seeing." Those were his last words. He was strapped to the plank. The lunette clamped down on his thick neck. The blade fell. Sanson did as he was told. He reached into the basket, grabbed the hair of the severed head, and lifted it high for the crowd to see. The eyes were reportedly still open, the lip curled in that permanent, defiant sneer. For a moment the crowd was silent. Then a roar went up, not of joy, but of shock. The Titan was dead. The steel fell, silencing the man who had saved France, but strictly speaking, it could not sever the link between the executioner and the executed. As the crowd dispersed in stunned silence, leaving the blood to dry on the scaffold, they carried with them the heavy, terrifying weight of Danton's final prophecy. The Titan was dead, buried in quicklime to erase his memory, but his ghost immediately began to stalk the halls of power, hunting the man who had signed his death warrant. Robespierre was now the undisputed master of a graveyard, unaware that he was already walking toward his own open grave. The sun went down on April 5, 1794, but the darkness that fell over Paris was not merely the absence of light, it was a void. The Titan was dead. The voice that had rallied the nation against the Prussians, the voice that had justified the massacres and then begged for mercy, was silenced. His massive headless body, along with those of Desmoulins and the others, was unceremoniously dumped into a wooden cart and rattled over the cobblestones to the cemetery of Heretic. There were no speeches. There was no state funeral. The bodies were stripped and thrown into a common trench. To ensure that Danton would never rise again, the grave diggers poured a layer of quicklime over the corpses. The chemical hissed as it ate away the flesh of the man who had once been the physical embodiment of the revolution. The intention was to erase him from the earth, to turn the man of August 10th into nothing but dust and forgotten bones. But you cannot bury a volcano. In the days following the execution, a strange, suffocating atmosphere gripped the capital. The indulgents were gone, but the relief that Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety had expected did not come. Instead, fear became absolute. If Danton, a man who had helped build the Republic with his bare hands, a man with friends, money, and popularity, could be killed like a common criminal, then who was safe? The deputies of the National Convention stopped sleeping in their own beds. They stopped speaking to one another in the hallways, terrified that a casual word could be twisted into a death sentence. Robespierre was now the undisputed master of France. He had eliminated the Hebertists on the left and the Dantonists on the right. The path was clear to build his Republic of Virtue. But Danton's absence was louder than his presence ever was. Robespierre withdrew further into himself. He stopped attending the meetings of the committee. He sat in his room at the Duplay house, obsessively reading reports, suspecting everyone. The ghost of Danton seemed to hover in the corner of his eye, that scarred face sneering at his virtue. The prophecy Danton had shouted, "I drag you down with me," began to work its way through the machinery of the state. Without Danton to act as the chaotic human counterweight, the revolution lost its balance. It became sterile, cold, and mathematically cruel. In June 1794, Robespierre attempted to fill the spiritual void left by the atheistic excesses of the revolution. He organized the festival of the Supreme Being. It was a massive choreographed spectacle on the Champ de Mars. Robespierre, dressed in a sky-blue coat and holding a bouquet of flowers and wheat, marched at the head of the procession like a messiah. He set fire to a papier-mâché statue representing atheism, revealing a statue of wisdom underneath. To his sycophants, it was the dawn of a new golden age, but to the cynical survivors of Danton's faction, it was a farce. They whispered in the back rows. They could almost hear Danton's booming laughter at the sight of the little lawyer playing high priest. "Look at the bugger," one deputy muttered. "He wants to be God." Danton's earthiness, his vulgarity, and his appreciation for the absurd were sorely missed. The revolution had become a church, and Robespierre was its inquisitor. Paranoia accelerated. 2 days after the festival, Robespierre pushed through the Law of 22 Prairial. It was the ultimate instrument of terror. It stripped the accused of the right to a defense counsel. It removed the need for witnesses. It gave the jury only 2 options: acquittal or death. The Great Terror began. The guillotine, which had claimed Danton, now worked with industrial speed. In just 6 weeks, over 1,300 people were beheaded in Paris alone. The gutters of the Place du Trône Renversé had to be specially dug deeper to carry away the torrent of blood. The smell of death was everywhere. The people of Paris, who had cheered the fall of the king, were now sickened. The bloodletting that Danton had once accepted as a necessary evil had become a senseless deluge. By late July 1794, the revolutionary month of Thermidor, the tension broke. The deputies of the convention realized that Robespierre intended to purge them next. Survival instinct trumped ideology. The men who had conspired to kill Danton, Fouché, Tallien, Barras, now conspired to kill Robespierre. They were not motivated by virtue, they were motivated by the fear of their own necks. On the 9th of Thermidor, July 27th, the final act of Danton's vengeance played out in the halls of the convention. Robespierre climbed the podium to speak, to denounce a new list of nameless traitors. But this time, the silence did not hold. "Down with the tyrant," someone shouted. Robespierre stopped, stunned. He tried to speak, but the hall erupted in chaos. "Down with the tyrant," they chanted. The president of the convention, Thuriot, a former friend of Danton, rang his bell relentlessly, drowning out Robespierre's thin voice. Robespierre tried to shout over the din, but his voice cracked and failed him. He gasped for air, turning purple with frustration and fear. In that moment of weakness, a deputy named Garnier de l'Aube stood up and delivered the line that sealed the connection between the 2 fallen titans. "The blood of Danton chokes you," he screamed across the hall. It was the verdict of history, delivered in real time. Robespierre was not being silenced by a political argument. He was being silenced by the memory of the friend he had murdered. The spell was broken. The convention voted for Robespierre's arrest. The following night was a chaotic mirror image of the night Danton fell. Robespierre and his followers were holed up in the Hôtel de Ville, just as Danton had been during the insurrection of August 10th. But there was no audacity here. Robespierre tried to shoot himself, shattering his jaw. He spent his final hours lying on a table, bleeding, unable to speak, enduring the same mockery he had inflicted on others. On the 10th of Thermidor, Robespierre was dragged to the scaffold. He was bandaged in agony and terrified. As the executioner ripped the bandage from his broken jaw, he let out a scream that echoed across the square, a scream of pure animal pain that ended the reign of terror. Danton's prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. Robespierre had followed him. The house of the Duplays, where Robespierre lived, would eventually be dismantled. The revolution that had eaten its children finally choked on the last bone. But what of the personal wreckage Danton left behind? While the political giants slaughtered each other, Danton's family retreated into the shadows. His young widow, Louise Gély, was only 17 when the axe fell. She was left with the memories of a 4-month marriage to a man who had terrified and fascinated the world. She did not throw herself onto a pyre. She did what Danton would have wanted. She chose life. She eventually remarried, this time to a man named Baron Dupin. In a strange twist of irony, she entered the very aristocracy that her first husband had helped to destroy. She lived a long, quiet life, surviving well into the 19th century. She rarely spoke of Danton. The memories were perhaps too massive, too dangerous. She faded into the comfortable anonymity of the French bourgeoisie, the class Danton was born into and never truly left. Danton's two sons by his first wife, Gabrielle, Antoine and François, also survived. They were raised by their grandmother and a wet nurse. They grew up carrying the heavy burden of the name Danton. In the years following the revolution, the name was a curse. Danton was viewed by the restored monarchy as a regicide and a monster. The sons did not enter politics. They did not seek to vindicate their father. They became quiet, respectable men. One became a brilliant engineer, the other a lawyer. They lived the life Danton had dreamed of in his final months, a life of peace, far from the rostrum and the guillotine. The Danton line continued, flowing like a subterranean river beneath the history of France, quiet and unseen, while the name of their ancestor raged in the history books. For decades after his death, Danton's reputation remained in purgatory. The royalists hated him for the death of the king. The Republicans, influenced by the Robespierrists, hated him for his corruption and his lack of virtue. He was painted as a brute, a traitor who sold his country for gold. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that the resurrection began. Historians like Michelet began to look past the corruption and see the humanity. They saw that while Robespierre was the head of the revolution, cold, calculating, theoretical, Danton was its heart. He was the blood, the sweat, the adrenaline. He was the only one who understood that a revolution cannot survive on virtue alone. It needs bread, it needs audacity, and sometimes it needs forgiveness. Today in the Latin Quarter of Paris, at the Carrefour de l'Odéon, stands a bronze statue of Georges-Jacques Danton. It was erected in 1891, nearly a century after his death. He stands on a pedestal, his finger pointing toward the horizon, his mouth open in mid-shout. He is rallying the troops. He is warning the enemies. He stands just a few streets away from where he lived, from where he loved Gabrielle, and from where he was arrested. The tourists walk past him, often unaware of the violence and the tragedy contained in that bronze figure. But he stands there still, a permanent reminder of the moment when a country decided to tear itself apart to be born again. He is the reminder that the path to liberty is not paved with marble, but with mud and blood. He reminds us that even the greatest men are flawed. But above all, his ghost still stands on that scaffold, daring us to judge him and shouting across the centuries that to truly live, we must have audacity, more audacity, and always audacity.